From the outside, the train station looked calm that morning. Sunlight filtered through tall windows. Travelers moved through the space without urgency. Nothing suggested that history was about to change. James Abram Garfield had been president for only a few months. 4 months to be exact. In that short time, he had already developed a reputation for intelligence, humility, and quiet resolve. He was not a man who sought power for its own sake. Garfield's life story was, in many ways, the embodiment of 19th-century American aspiration. He was born into poverty in Ohio. His father died when he was young. Money was scarce and expectations were low, but Garfield possessed an unusual appetite for learning. He worked as a canal boat laborer. He taught himself classical languages. Eventually, he attended college, then became a teacher himself. Colleagues described him as disciplined, curious, and deeply reflective. Education was not simply a career for him, it was a moral calling. Over time, Garfield moved into public service. He served as a state senator. Later, he became a member of Congress. For nearly 2 decades, he worked inside a political system defined by compromise, patronage, and personal loyalty. Yet even within that environment, Garfield stood out. Friends noted his reluctance to engage in political theater. He disliked personal attacks. He avoided grandstanding. Instead, he focused on policy, principle, and institutional reform. This temperament would matter later. When Garfield became president in early 1881, he did not arrive as a conquering hero. In fact, his nomination surprised many observers. He had not aggressively sought the office. He was chosen as a compromise candidate at a deeply divided party convention. From a psychological perspective, this matters. Garfield did not view the presidency as personal validation. He saw it as responsibility. That distinction shaped how he governed and how he interacted with people seeking favors. At the time, American politics operated under what was known as the spoils system. Government jobs were routinely awarded based on loyalty rather than competence. Supporters expected positions as rewards. Refusal was often interpreted as betrayal. Garfield opposed this system. He believed civil service positions should be earned through merit. He understood that dismantling patronage would create enemies. Still, he pressed forward. This decision placed him on a collision course with a man who believed his destiny had been stolen. Charles Guiteau was not part of Garfield's inner circle. He was not a respected political figure. In fact, he had failed in nearly every career he attempted. Law, business, religion, writing. Each effort ended in disappointment. Those who encountered Guiteau often described him as grandiose. He spoke with certainty about his own importance. He struggled to accept rejection, and he interpreted setbacks as evidence of conspiracy rather than limitation. During the presidential campaign, Guiteau attached himself loosely to the political process. He wrote a speech supporting Garfield, then rewrote it to support the opposing candidate, then changed it again. He printed copies. He handed them out sporadically. In his own mind, this made him indispensable. After Garfield's inauguration, Guiteau became fixated on one idea. He believed he deserved a diplomatic appointment. Specifically, he believed he should be sent to France as a government representative. He visited the White House repeatedly. He waited. He wrote letters. He demanded recognition. Each time, he was turned away or ignored. From a psychological standpoint, this pattern is significant. Individuals with rigid grandiosity often experience rejection as existential threat. When reality contradicts their self-image, they search for meaning elsewhere. Guiteau found that meaning in religion, not faith in the traditional sense, but interpretation. He began to believe that God communicated with him directly, that his thoughts were not his own, that his frustration was part of a divine plan. He later described receiving what he called a divine inspiration. In his mind, this inspiration was clear and absolute. He believed that removing the president was not a crime, it was an obligation. Meanwhile, Garfield continued his work, largely unaware of the danger forming at the margins of his public life. Presidential security in the 19th century was minimal. There was no permanent protective detail. Public schedules were widely known. This openness reflected the era's values. Leaders were expected to be accessible. Visibility signaled trust. Distance implied elitism. Garfield embraced this culture. He walked freely through public spaces. He greeted strangers. He traveled without elaborate protection. In early July, he planned a brief summer trip. He intended to travel with his sons. The destination was Massachusetts. The journey would begin at a train station in Washington, District of Columbia. The details of this trip were not secret. They appeared in newspapers. They circulated among political circles. For most people, this was routine information. For Guiteau, it was opportunity. On the morning of the departure, Garfield arrived at the station. He was relaxed. He was accompanied by family and associates. There was no sense of danger in the air. What no one present understood was that this moment would become a turning point in American history. Not because of a single act alone, but because of what it would reveal about politics, mental illness, and medical practice. This case would later teach historians and psychologists a difficult lesson. Major national tragedies do not always emerge from grand conspiracies. Sometimes, they grow from neglected systems and misunderstood minds. As Garfield walked through the station, the future of the presidency was about to change. But for now, everything still appeared normal. And that illusion of normalcy is where this story truly begins. The morning unfolded without urgency. Passengers moved toward platforms, porters called out destinations, steam drifted through the station. James Garfield walked calmly through the space. He spoke briefly with companions. His son stayed close by his side. Nothing in his posture suggested concern. Nearby, Charles Guiteau waited. He had arrived early. He positioned himself near a walkway Garfield would pass through. In his pocket, he carried a small handgun. Guiteau later explained his thinking in stark terms. He believed the moment had been chosen for him. He believed resistance would be sinful. This framing allowed him to act without hesitation. From a psychological perspective, this belief structure is critical. When individuals externalize responsibility to divine authority, moral restraint collapses, personal accountability disappears, action becomes inevitable. As Garfield approached, Guiteau stepped forward. There was no warning, no shouted words, just sudden movement. 2 shots were fired in quick succession. One struck the president's arm. The other entered his back. The sound echoed through the station. People froze. Then panic followed. Several men rushed toward Garfield as he collapsed. Others attempted to restrain Guiteau. Garfield remained conscious. He spoke quietly. He asked those around him not to panic. His composure surprised witnesses. Guiteau did not flee. He surrendered immediately. He reportedly stated that he had done his duty. Authorities quickly took him into custody. At the scene, confusion dominated the response. There was no coordinated emergency protocol. Medical knowledge at the time was limited. Urgency replaced caution. Several individuals attempted to help the wounded president. Hands reached toward the injury. Clothing was pulled aside. No one understood the danger of contamination. Doctors were summoned quickly. They began examining Garfield where he lay. Their focus centered on locating the bullet. This decision would prove consequential. Repeated attempts were made to probe the wound. Fingers and instruments entered without sterilization. Each effort increased the risk of infection. At the time, this risk was poorly understood. Garfield was transported from the station. He was moved to the White House. There, doctors continued their search. They believed removing the bullet was essential. From a modern medical perspective, this approach was flawed. The bullet had missed vital organs. Garfield's condition was initially stable. Rest and cleanliness might have been sufficient. Instead, days turned into weeks of invasive treatment. Physicians disagreed with one another. Multiple examinations occurred daily. Each introduced new bacteria. Garfield's health began to decline. Fever set in. He lost weight steadily. His strength faded. Throughout this period, the nation watched closely. Newspapers issued constant updates. Public concern grew. Hope fluctuated with each report. Meanwhile, Guiteau remained in custody. He showed no remorse. He insisted the president's condition was irrelevant. In his mind, the outcome belonged to God. This distinction would later become central to his defense. He admitted to firing the shots. He denied responsibility for the death that followed. He blamed the doctors. As weeks passed, Garfield's condition worsened. Infections spread throughout his body. His heart weakened. Breathing became difficult. Eventually, complications overwhelmed him. Nearly 3 months after the attack, he passed away. The immediate cause involved systemic infection and organ failure. The original wounds were not the decisive factor. This sequence shocked the public. It challenged assumptions about medicine. It exposed weaknesses in emergency response. It forced uncomfortable questions. Could this outcome have been prevented? Did treatment accelerate decline? Who, ultimately, was responsible? Investigators would soon face these questions directly. They would also confront Guiteau's state of mind. The legal battle ahead would be unlike any before it. And as the nation mourned, a trial was already taking shape. As the nation mourned, investigators shifted focus toward accountability. The legal process moved quickly. Public pressure was intense. Everyone wanted answers. Charles Guiteau was formally charged soon after the president's death. From the outset, it was clear this would not be an ordinary trial. His behavior was erratic. His confidence remained unshaken. Guiteau spoke freely with reporters. He wrote letters from his cell. He proclaimed himself a hero. In his view, history would vindicate him. The trial began later that year. Courtrooms filled daily. Journalists traveled from across the country. Public fascination bordered on obsession. From a legal standpoint, the central question was responsibility. Guiteau admitted to firing the shots. That fact was not disputed. What remained contested was intent and causation. Guiteau's defense rested on two intertwined claims. First, he argued that he was not mentally responsible. Second, he claimed the president's death resulted from medical mismanagement. He insisted he had merely wounded the president. This argument forced the court to explore uncharted territory. Mental illness had rarely been examined so publicly. Expert testimony was inconsistent. Psychiatry itself was still evolving. Observers noted Guiteau's courtroom conduct immediately. He interrupted proceedings. He shouted at witnesses. He insulted attorneys and judges alike. At times, he appeared oblivious to consequence. At other moments, he was sharply manipulative. This inconsistency confused observers. It also divided medical experts. Some physicians testified that Guiteau understood his actions. Others believed he suffered from severe delusions. There was no consensus. The jury was left to interpret behavior without modern diagnostic tools. From a psychological perspective, this ambiguity is revealing. Severe grandiosity can coexist with functional reasoning. Delusional beliefs do not always eliminate awareness of right and wrong. This complicates legal definitions of responsibility. Guiteau himself undermined his own defense. He insisted that God directed his actions, yet he also expressed frustration over political rejection. These motives overlapped uncomfortably. Meanwhile, medical testimony about the president's treatment drew scrutiny. Doctors described their efforts in detail. They defended their decisions as standard practice. Few acknowledged the role of infection. This case would later influence medical reform profoundly. The dangers of unclean treatment became undeniable. Public trust in blind authority weakened. Scientific medicine began to change. Despite the defense's arguments, the prosecution remained focused. They emphasized planning, they emphasized motive, they emphasized Guiteau's own words. Witnesses recalled his repeated visits to the White House. They described his fixation on appointment. They noted his escalating frustration. These patterns formed a clear narrative. The jury deliberated briefly. Their decision was decisive. They rejected the insanity defense. They found Guiteau fully responsible. Sentencing followed soon after. Guiteau showed little reaction. He continued to speak of destiny. He predicted posthumous praise. From a broader perspective, the outcome reflected societal limits of compassion. Mental illness was poorly understood. Tolerance for disorder was low. Public anger shaped perception. The execution was scheduled for the following year. Until that moment, Guiteau remained convinced of his righteousness. He rehearsed speeches. He composed poetry. As the final date approached, attention returned to the meaning of the case. What had truly ended the life of President James Garfield? A bullet, a belief, or a system unprepared for either. When Guiteau was finally put to death, he did not recant. He remained defiant until the end. History, however, rendered its own judgment. The assassination exposed deep cracks in politics, in medicine, in understanding the human mind, and its lessons would echo long after Charles Guiteau was gone. In the months that followed, the nation began to reflect. Not only on what had happened, but on why it unfolded the way it did. The death of a president had exposed vulnerabilities far beyond one individual. James Garfield's legacy quickly shifted. He was remembered not for legislative achievements. He was remembered as a symbol of transition, a bridge between old systems and modern reforms. One of the most immediate consequences involved government employment. Public outrage focused on the spoils system. The idea that unstable individuals could seek power through patronage disturbed many. Reform gained momentum. Within 2 years, Congress passed sweeping civil service legislation. Merit-based examinations replaced favoritism. Job security reduced political pressure. This shift permanently altered American governance. From a psychological standpoint, the case also reshaped understanding of mental illness. Guiteau forced the public to confront uncomfortable realities. Delusion could coexist with planning. Faith could merge with resentment. Experts later identified patterns consistent with severe narcissistic pathology. grandiosity, persecution beliefs, moral externalization. These traits are now widely studied. At the time, however, language was limited, treatment was minimal, legal frameworks were rigid, the system lacked nuance. Medical practice also changed dramatically. Garfield's decline became a case study. Physicians re-examined assumptions about intervention. Cleanliness moved from theory to necessity. Within a generation, antiseptic procedures became standard, hand-washing protocols were formalized, instrument sterilization became routine, countless lives were saved as a result. In this sense, Garfield's death was not meaningless. It accelerated progress, it forced accountability, it reshaped institutions, yet the human cost remained immense. Garfield's family endured prolonged uncertainty. The nation watched him fade slowly. Hope lingered longer than it should have. This prolonged suffering also altered expectations of presidential protection. Public accessibility gave way to caution. Security measures increased gradually. The role of the Secret Service expanded. Modern presidents now operate within layers of protection. Schedules are controlled. Threats are assessed continuously. These practices trace their roots to cases like this one. There is also a quieter lesson embedded in this story. Warning signs are often visible. Guiteau's instability was not sudden, it escalated over time. Repeated rejection intensified fixation, isolation reinforced delusion. No system existed to intervene early. Today, that gap still exists in many forms. This case teaches us that violence is rarely spontaneous. It emerges from interaction between mind and environment, from unmet expectations, from systems that fail to recognize risk. It also teaches restraint. Garfield's wounds were survivable. Treatment transformed injury into fatal illness. Good intentions without knowledge can be dangerous. As history settled, James Garfield became a quiet figure, less discussed than others, often overshadowed, yet his story remains uniquely instructive. He represents unrealized potential, a presidency interrupted, a nation forced to learn painfully, a reminder that progress often follows tragedy. The assassination of President Garfield was not only an act of violence, it was a convergence of belief, neglect, and transition. Understanding that convergence matters, because the most important question is not what happened, it is why it was allowed to happen, and that question still resonates today. History often remembers moments, not conditions, a single shot, a single name, a single date. But this case resists that simplicity. James Garfield did not lose his life solely because someone acted against him. He lost his life within a system unprepared to recognize danger, unprepared to manage medical crisis, unprepared to address severe psychological instability. From a broader perspective, this is what makes the case enduringly relevant. It sits at the intersection of governance, mental health, and science. Each element failed in a different way. Together they produced irreversible consequences. Garfield believed in institutions. He believed reform was possible. Ironically, it was his absence that accelerated change. His death accomplished what his presidency could not. This story is not about notoriety. It is not about spectacle. It is about lessons learned too late and systems forced to evolve under pressure. When we study this case today, we are not revisiting the past for shock value. We are examining how fragile stability can be, how warning signs are ignored, how progress is often reactive. The assassination of President James A. Garfield remains one of the most instructive tragedies in American history, not because it was dramatic, but because it was preventable.